This video will contain spoilers for the entire numbered Xenoblade Chronicles trilogy. Xenoblade 3 has left more than a few mysteries in its wake, but perhaps the biggest, at least as of now, is the premise behind the story DLC campaign we were promised prior to launch. I am not here today to give a definitive statement as to what it's going to be, but I would like to discuss the two options the community seems to have rallied around, as well as give my own opinions as to what I personally would want to see and what I think is most feasible or likely. Effectively, the two premises that the community zeroed in on are either a spiritual successor to Xenoblade 2's DLC, that being a tragic prequel detailing the downfall of the first city, the founders, and the establishment of the second city, or a spiritual successor to the epilogue added in Xenoblade Definitive Edition, that being something that takes place after the game's main story, and probably revolves around the two worlds seeking to reunite. Thankfully, unlike a lot of other instances, I have not seen the fandom become particularly toxic over this. It just seems to be, for the most part, people believing that it's been hinted to be one specific thing, or just genuinely preferring one specific thing over the other, and that's doubly good because there are valid reasons to both believe and disbelieve in either of these possibilities being true. That's more than enough to be worth a discussion already, but there are two other very big points that I think make this even more interesting to talk about and see people's varied opinions on. I've made videos tangentially discussing both of these topics, so I'm going to try and go through these quickly and leave you with the iCards if you haven't seen them already. The first is that the executive director of the series has already told us that after playing 3 in its story DLC, we should have a good idea of where the series is going, and yet, as of now, a lot of people are unsatisfied with the way 3 ended, and I don't know where the series is going, and am only going to have a decent idea of where it's going if the premise of the story DLC is one of the two options I'm discussing later. The second point, and this one I think is a bit less objective, so you're more than welcome to disagree with me here, is that the further distanced we get from release, the more obvious it seems to me that they intentionally held back on a lot of fan service moments in the base game of 3, and are saving those for DLC in the effort of making 3 more able to stand on its own as its own product and not just live in the shadow of its older brothers, as well as potentially being a better starting point. This practice I don't personally think is particularly scummy in this specific instance, because the stuff they're saving for DLC is fan service. That's the kind of thing that only really matters to people who are already invested in the series, who are the exact kind of people who are more likely to buy the DLC pass, and are the most likely people to have bought it already without even knowing everything it contains. The thing with that is, the only real big piece of fan service we've gotten from the DLC so far is the piece of key art it was revealed with, which depicts the 3 main swords of the male Xenoblade protagonists together. We've already gotten a trailer depicting the second wave of DLC, which includes the first new hero, Ino, and Challenge Battle. And while Ino is very obviously an artificial blade built by either Tora or one of his disciples, and her quest will likely contain at least minor bits of lore relating to him or the construction or function of Origin, she's still a brand new character, and the silhouette of the second DLC hero also appears to be someone completely new as well. That's already the 2 DLC heroes we were promised accounted for, and neither of them appears to be a big fan service returning cameo character. It's of course important to keep in mind that those 2 heroes are not necessarily the only 2 we're going to get. As I discussed in my last video, the data mine heavily suggests there are at least 3 more that were planned at the very least at some point, but again, all 3 of those characters are Xenoblade 3 characters and not returning ones. And while Xenoblade 2's DLC pass ended up including twice as many rare blades as it was initially advertised with, and the 3 it wasn't initially advertised with were all cameos, those cameo characters were tied to Challenge Battle mode, and when they first showed off Challenge Battle mode in a Nintendo Treehouse stream, they showed it off with Shulk and Fiora, while the Ino trailer also included our first look at Xenoblade 3's Challenge mode, and it appeared to basically be the same as Xenoblade Definitive Editions, which means no cameo characters. As you may have gathered already, it really seems like, unless they're just straight up lying to us with a picture of the 3 swords, that art is specifically relevant to the story DLC, and was chosen to be the key art for the entire expansion pass because, like with 2, the story DLC is the capstone piece of it, and probably the thing the most people are excited for. Admittedly, the Occam's razor explanation for all of this is probably just we don't have all of the information and they are intentionally withholding stuff from us in order to avoid spoiling a game that's still pretty new, or as part of some 4D chess marketing strategy, but that's kind of boring and unfun, and as you may have noticed, I really like speculating on this kind of thing, so I'm going to operate under the assumption that the picture of the three swords is somehow relevant to the story DLC for the rest of this video. The first big deal from that is that simply making the assumption pushes us way past the vague notion of there will be fan service, and straight to the potential reality of Shulk, seemingly from at the very least the ending bit of Future Connected, Rex and Pyra, and Noah all meeting. And that much at least shouldn't really be a surprise, as Shulk and Fiora meeting the Xenoblade 2 party was a big deal in Xenoblade 2's challenge mode, and Elma was also there, though she had a lot more generic interactions. And then of course we got Rex, Shulk, Elma, and Cosmos all interacting in non-voiced content, where they talked about how them all being together probably means something. The issues arise if you try and project that meeting with those specific swords onto either of the two DLC story premises, because if you think about it, neither actually makes a lot of sense. One thing the Founder premise absolutely has over the Epilogue premise is that the nature of the Founders already gives you a party composition that's exactly the same as the main game. There are 6 Founders, all of them were Ouroboros, and then there was also the legend of the mysterious 7th Founder who would be a shoe-in for the hero slot. Unfortunately, this does not hold for the meeting of the protagonists, as while there are statues that are said to resemble Noah and Mio among the Founders, they clearly are not actually previous incarnations of them, most likely being descendants from previous incarnations. Additionally, the Founders were active during the time period when N destroyed the original city and the new city, the one we see in the game, was founded, and it's heavily implied that the Noah and Mio we play as are the first new incarnations of Noah and Mio after N and M became Mobius, which means there is no Noah and Mio that would be protagonists acting at the time. And additionally, well, we do know that previous Noahs all seem to have had a previous version of Lucky 7, and the fact that there seem to be multiple swords that are the same is going to be relevant later. We also see in flashbacks that the weapon model they chose to use for every previous incarnation of Noah, including the ones that died, was N's sword and not present-day Noah's. Admittedly, that doesn't make a lot of sense and could easily be a mistake, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for any Noah that hasn't already become Mobius to use a weapon that has an infinity symbol on it already, but the point remains, they could have chosen to use present Noah's sword, and yet they didn't, so I think it's still relevant. Obviously, the key art could be covering up spoilers by using present Noah's sword, and it could just be that versions of the protagonists will meet and not necessarily team up, but the fact that they used the much less iconic Monado Rex Plus to represent Shulk, despite the Monado 1 being a weapon skin you can use in Xenoblade 3, suggests to me that the key art does have at least some adherence to canon in it. Then, there's also the fact that while there did seem to be a version of Shulk and Rex running around at that time, they were not Founders. They were mentors of the Founders, which means that in that DLC campaign premise, they would be heroes at most and not main characters, which seems like a bit of a missed opportunity if you're going to have them around in the first place. It is worth mentioning that Cassini's mentor Rex is the only one of the two who's explicitly confirmed by the statue descriptions to have been around during the time period this DLC premise would take place in, and we don't necessarily know if the version of Shulk that was Reed's mentor was actually still alive at the time. However, there is still the possibility that the founder of Ortiz was actually a different version of Shulk, which yes, would make Shulk an actual main character, not hero. However, that seems to be a young Shulk and not the older mentor version of him that I think most people want to see. And while Ortiz is stated to have invented his own weapon, it seems extremely unlikely that a version of Shulk in a completely different context from Future Connected would have created the Rex Plus again unless he literally had blueprints from his previous incarnation. And the fact that that idea would then have a younger version of Shulk as a main playable character, and then an older version of Rex relegated to just being a hero, would really upset the balance of fan service in a way I'm not sure Monolith would be willing to do. On the other hand, the Epilogue premise has issues as well. While Shulk and Rex's weapons make perfect sense, there's not really any commentary I can make here. Those are what they would still be using after the end of their games. Noah is where we run into problems. Not the least is the fact that the only Noah we've seen after the end of the game does not have a sword whatsoever. And no, I'm not talking about him chucking Lucky 7 off the edge of Keves Castle, I'm talking about the 10-year-old we see in the post-credit scene. Now, that's not to say 10-year-old Noah wouldn't use a sword. We see him in flashbacks using weapons fine, and it's very, very likely that an epilogue DLC would time-skip ahead from the post-credit scene and age everyone back up to their late teens. However, even more than Shulk and Rex, Noah is the kind of character who would avoid fighting if at all possible, which means while Shulk carried his junk sword for self-defense, and Rex had a weapon because he was actively being trained by Gramps and needed to fight as part of his job, I don't think Noah would have any training or even carry a weapon, especially in the time of peace that we can expect after the end of Xenoblade 1. That being said, it's not impossible for him to decide he has to fight for some reason or another, and have a weapon made for him during the DLC story. The non-Lucky 7 part of his blade in the main game is just a generic Keves sword colored red, and it's been pretty obvious to me since the first trailer that Keves weaponry is heavily based on replica Monado technology developed by Shulk during and after Future Connected, so a generic sword like that is probably a mass-produced thing at the time Noah has been born, so that much at least he can probably just go to a weapon store and buy himself, even if he starts out the DLC with no connection to Shulk whatsoever. You might be thinking that the Lucky 7 part of his blade is where I'm going to say things get weird, but that's actually not the case. I do want to eventually make a video on Lucky 7 and Ouroboros because the way they function is actually very similar, but in very broad strokes, Lucky 7 is actually not this super special thing. Not only is it shown that at least two are capable of existing at the same time between N and Noah, but I also think it's pretty clear that while it's called magic and does things no other weapons in Ionios are capable of doing, it's not actually this super out there thing as a concept. Lucky 7 is just a special model replica Monado forged from Origin metal that's capable of resonating with the wills of people locked within Origin to power itself up. When first drawn in Chapter 2, it is just an extremely powerful sword that's made of the only thing in the world sharp enough to cut a flame clock, but after Noah fully awakens and unlocks the Draw Lucky 7 talent art at the beginning of Chapter 6, he also gains a bunch of unique arts that all have Chinese symbols for icons just like every other Monado art in the series, and two of the symbols are even reused from Monado Purge and Monado Buster, both of which were arts Shulk himself had and not exclusive to Malos or Zanza, which lends more weight to the idea that Shulk himself did have a hand in creating Lucky 7. While I'm almost certain that Lucky 7 was not invented until after Ionios was created, that does not detract from the possibility of it being created outside of it. The only thing you'd be missing out on is its extremely powerful ability to draw on souls in Origin, but replica Monado technology already exists outside of Ionios, and Origin metal already exists outside of Ionios. That's one of the few things that I have zero explanation for, but Origin was created, which means the ability to create Origin metal exists. Which means that if Noah remembers enough about Ionios and is able to get in contact with Shulk, he can literally just ask Shulk to make a version of Lucky 7, and Shulk will be able to. It will be weaker than the one he had in Ionios because it doesn't have the soul power, but I'm guessing Shulk would still be able to give him a nerfed version of it that still has the being a very sharp sword property and probably also Monado arts. The real issue with Noah's weapon here is actually the Ouroboros symbol. Again, they could just be using the most iconic, most recurring version of Noah's sword because it's promotional material that was revealed before the game came out. I still think it's interesting to think about because I would not expect to see the Ouroboros on the weapon of a post-ending Noah. I wouldn't even expect the half-filled blue circle that was there before he became Ouroboros, because that symbol is tied to the flame clock, and flame clocks don't exist in the original worlds. I actually would expect there to be nothing there, just more of a hole that allowed you to see more of Lucky 7 underneath, and that actually would be cool not only on a thematic level, but it also would make Lucky 7 look a lot closer to the typical Monado design. If you've seen my ending video, you might be a bit confused because I did bring up a lot of points to suggest that Noah and Mio might be interlinking in the post-credit scene when Noah disappears. However, after more time and more thought, I have to agree with what comments and people elsewhere have said, where it's probably supposed to be a lot more metaphorical and just indicative of the fact that they reconnect in some way in the future and not them literally interlinking, especially because there's no particle effect suggesting anything like that, and no one reacts to Noah disappearing, so I think I'm more comfortable believing that the music playing is Noah somehow recalling a bit of Ionios, and him disappearing is metaphorical of him reconnecting with Mio. I do still stand by my position that the lyrics of the ending theme are very important, and that the whole part of the narrator seeing someone in their dreams is indicative of the possibility that through dreams, Noah and Mio are able to see each other and recall pieces of Ionios, so I would not be surprised if a potential epilogue DLC story has to do with Noah trying to reconnect with the literal girl of his dreams. That all goes to say that I no longer believe the Noah we see in the post-credit scene has Ouroboros powers, which is of course backed up by the fact that there are multiple incarnations of Noah and Mio within Ionios that became Ouroboros, and they had to re-unlock it with an Ouroboros stone every single time, and since post-credit scene Noah is technically a different body than the one from the beginning of the game and the one we play as, he would not retain any special powers or privileges a previous life of his may have unlocked. That's not to say interlinking won't be a thing in the DLC, I'm almost certain there will at least be an equivalent mechanic, or that, like my idea for Lucky 7, Ouroboros is not capable of being reinvented outside Ionios in a nerf state. I'm just saying that it's highly unlikely, unless the DLC somehow takes place during the main story, that Noah will start out as an Ouroboros. Now, of course, if he unlocks it early on and has it for the majority of the story, then yeah, it still makes perfect sense to represent him with it. But at that point, I think we're actually making enough assumptions for even me to consider this no longer legitimate speculation. So with the Great Sword controversy out of the way, what are some other pros and cons of the two DLC concepts people have gravitated towards? Going in timeline order and starting with a prequel, the first thing is Torna was wildly successful and extremely well received by basically everyone who played it, even people who did not like the main game of 2, so repeating the formula seems like a good recipe for success. On the other hand, just doing Torna again is very safe and retreading a lot of old ground, which seems very antithetical to Monolith's philosophy of taking a risk by doing something completely different every time they make a new Xenoblade game, so in terms of what the developers making the series would do, I think this is less likely than an epilogue. On the other hand, taking a glimpse into the past could allow us to get better explanations for a lot of things about how Ionios works that were not explained. Just as one example, the only thing we really know about Napon is that they have lives longer than just 10 years, and according to X, they weren't supposed to interfere, I guess, directly with Mobius's control over the world, which you can easily extrapolate to assume that there's some sort of non-interference pact in effect, and that Napon were intentionally laying low in order to subvert Mobius in various ways, including giving Lucky 7s to people who might be able to make use of them, but that doesn't explain how they actually work. Based on the sex ed scene, it seems like ones outside the city do not know about natural birth, but at the same time, there's no indication that they can be born from cradles like everyone else, so there's really no explanation for where they're from, and a past version of Ionios leaves a lot of opportunities to explain stuff like this. At the time of the first city's destruction, Mobius didn't have nearly as much control over the world as they do during the main game. Not only was Nia not in hiding, and potentially even Melia not kidnapped at the time, but the first city was bigger and not hidden, and Ionios itself was physically larger at the time, because 1,000 years worth of Annihilation events hadn't occurred yet. This difference in power dynamic leaves a lot more room for characters to be able to figure out things the main cast of Base 3 never got a chance to. Unfortunately, some of this exposition and explanation might have to be delivered either extremely clunkily or in a flashback within a flashback, because that line about the Founders being the first Ouroboros kind of has to be either a mistake or a mistranslation, as the Founders were contemporary to N destroying the first city and the creation of the second city, and yet not only were N and M implied to have been Ouroboros before they became Mobius, but we also see versions of Noah and Mio from even before then, who were also Ouroboros. And if you combine that with one of the statue descriptions saying that the Founders were able to fully realize the power of Ouroboros, I think it's more likely that they were the ones to realize the full potential of the Ouroboros system for the first time, and not quite literally the originals. That's not to say that wouldn't work, especially if Nia's still around to explain exactly how and why Ouroboros was created though, as a big point of Torna was Laura and Jin effectively inventing the main game's blade and driver system, so these Ouroboros not being the first by far, but still being the ones to perfect the system and inventing the way of using it the main cast of the base game uses, does track, but again, that's way too close to Torna, and I don't think would make as satisfying exposition as being there for the creation of this power in the first place. Oh, very briefly, while we're talking about the creation of things, I have seen a small amount of people suggest the DLC being even further in the past and detailing the construction of Origin, but I don't think this would work at all for a few reasons. First off, by definition of the worlds not having come together at all yet, you will have two separate parties for the entire time that never physically interact in the same space or join up to fight together, which seems extremely lame on multiple levels. Then, since it's in the past, there is no Noah of age to be properly fighting, so you wouldn't even get to control him at all during the DLC advertised with his weapon. And then, it's the construction of Origin. There is no conflict that could be derived from fighting, unless there's some sort of annihilationist faction who just wants the two worlds to be wiped out. So, while I think it would be an interesting story to explore, just like a prequel detailing Klaus in the lead up to performing the experiment, it's not anything that I would like to see in a game and should only be relegated to multimedia spin-offs that I really hope Xenoblade dives into at some point. One concern you might reasonably have about a Founders prequel DLC is the idea that there's zero victories to be had throughout the entire story. While yes, the kingdom was destroyed and thousands of people died in Torna, at the very least, Malos was stopped at the end. But if you really think about it, the only Mobius who need to make it through alive are N and M, X, Y, and Z, and maybe a Triton cameo if you really want to have him. Every other Mobius you put in the DLC can be a completely new character who gets killed off there, so the party members are allowed to make victories. It's pretty heavily implied that the city is capable of defeating Mobius without an active Ouroboros team, albeit at an extreme cost, and the plaque on the Cassini statue states that Rex, who was not an Ouroboros, struck fear into many a Mobius, which kinda implies he was capable of taking them out without such a power. So, as long as they only double up on letters that are characters that definitely didn't become Mobius until after that point in time, like Chris and Shania, or just invent some excuse for Mobius not using them at that point in time, they're home free. Your final battle against N is probably just going to be a holding the line thing to allow a small amount of people to escape, and after that, he'll make it out somehow, but at the very least, you're going to be able to take someone out. And remember, Console A hasn't shown up yet. There's a decent chance they're being saved for the story DLC if they don't show up in the quest lines for any of the DLC heroes. Now I think we get to my biggest issue with a potential Founders prequel, and that is again in its comparison to Torna. While I'd want it not just to be a retread of old ground and stand on its own and not just be Torna 2, there's one key place in which the setup for such a prequel in the base games differ. When it came to Torna being teased in Xenoblade 2, there were multiple flashbacks throughout the story that informed aspects of important characters in the present day, and the DLC story literally sprung out of a piece of planned story content from the main game that got too big to include there. In Xenoblade 3, we get a grand total of 0 flashbacks from the period in time in which this DLC prequel would take place, and nobody who's still around in the present day has really had any aspect of their character informed or defined by it, so it wouldn't really be as big of a character revelation like the ones for Jin and Mythra we got from Torna. The best you could argue is probably M and Nia, but it's not like the destruction of the city is what caused Nia to start resisting Mobius in the first place, because again, Ouroboros stones existed before then, and we learned basically everything we need to about M from stuff in the main game, and while yes, destroying the city was the cap on N's arc of becoming a villain, it was just the final step. It was just the thing he needed to do to get M to exist, so I'm not sure how much we'd stand to gain from seeing it directly, especially since most of the people he'd be fighting against are people we know nothing about. Even if both Queens, Rex, and Shulk are present there, there's still the fact that we know none of the 6 founders unless Ortiz really is another Shulk. Whereas in Torna, the only party members we don't outright meet in the base game are Laura, who we see multiple times in flashbacks that are given more context in Torna, Adam, whose existence still affects a lot of characters 500 years later and has multiple speaking appearances and flashbacks and a recorded message, Hugo, who we learn exists in a flashback, and Digion, who barely does anything in either time period, so he barely counts. Barring a potential Shulk Ortiz, the only founder who we might see on screen is Noah and Mio's child before they became N and M, and even then, I'm of the opinion that the founders of Houses Van Damme and Doyle were the children of that kid, so N and M's grandchildren, and not him and his younger sister, so in my estimations, we've only seen another potential background character. As for the gameplay side, in addition to giving you a pre-built full party complete with hero and at least 2 more potential heroes, 4 if both queens are also there, there's also the fact that they can reuse a lot more assets from the base game if the DLC story is also set in Ionios. I want to be very clear, I am not saying that we will not get a new area of some sort if the DLC is a prequel. Both of the previous Xenoblade story expansions included new areas that were among the largest in their respective games, and I would be very surprised if the story DLC does not come with an area that's roughly the size of either the Etia or Fornis regions. What I am saying is, they can reuse areas if they want to, and just edit them similar to how Gormott was changed for Torna the Golden Country to turn the clock back, doing things like filling in annihilation holes, or changing the position of colonies. As for the 3 main factions, Agnes and Keves do not need to change whatsoever. They exist to perpetuate the Endless Now. Of course they're not going to change over 1,000 years. The only real thing they'd need to do would be create some more Ferronuses, and they even have designs for outdated models in the main game already. They're just ruined, so some of the assets exist for that too. As for the Lost Numbers, I'm not sure how much about them needs to be changed either. As far as we can tell, their clothing style and technology hasn't really changed over 1,000 years. The most we can say is that Gilgamesh probably needs to be built during the time period where this DLC might take place. So the biggest thing related to them that needs to be created is the original city. There are 2 very good things about that. The first is we know as a fact it was located in the Cadencia region, which means they have a built-in excuse for reusing the largest area in the base game of Xenoblade 3. And the second is, the original city, while it almost certainly was not the first settlement on Ionios made by people not bound to the Flame Clock, the town outside Keves Castle seems to have been that before it was taken over by Mobius. It was created way closer to the inception of Ionios, which means the people who founded it might have even been the original people brought over with Origin, so it has a lot more opportunities to include fan service than the second city from the main game. Imagine, if you will, a side quest that reveals to you the origins of the painting from the Colony Zero arc, and it turns out that it was created by one Kenny Rohan. With all of that said and done though, my big sticking point is still the lack of connection we have to any of the characters or events that would be around during that time period. Exactly how much can only be gained from telling this specific story. From what I can see, it's more end content for people who really liked him, learning how exactly the founders of Ortiz and Rhodes lived to 80 years old despite being born as soldiers, and the mystery of the 7th founder. Everything else, like the history of the Lost Numbers, Shulk and Rex showing up, and more explanations for the mysteries of Ionios, can all be easily explained in either a different DLC story or something else in the game like a DLC Heroes side quest. Oh, and I also have at least a pretty good guess as to who the 7th founder is, at least in general terms, so that might not have even been a DLC hook, just another one of those things in Xenoblade 3 that is not explicitly stated, but by using previous knowledge of the series and a deeper analysis of the text, you are able to figure at least something out about. All in all, while there is a lot of potential in this premise, I still can't shake the feeling that it would just turn out to be a lesser version of Torna, and lesser version of anything that came before is the last thing I want to see from the DLC that ends what the developers themselves are referring to as the first big trilogy or arc of Xenoblade. As you might have guessed, I am personally on Team Epilogue, so let's discuss that premise next. This of course means both the pros and the cons, because this as an idea is not perfect either. Starting with the pros though, and viewing it from a more pragmatic standpoint at first, the biggest thing is probably it being significantly easier to work Shulk and Rex in major roles, as Rex is probably Mio's father, and Shulk would almost certainly be the one leading the charge on the scientific front to reconnect the worlds on the Xenoblade 1 side. I want to make it clear right now though that no matter what the DLC is about, you should not be expecting big important updates on every single major character from the previous 2 games, and not just because that would completely screw over any of the original Xenoblade 3 cast. And that's because, just counting the main controllable party members from 1 and 2, that is a dozen characters who you would need to get the voice actor back for, and write at least one bit of meaningful dialogue from to justify them being there in the first place, so don't be surprised if people who are already shafted in the main story, like Ricky and Morag, don't get anything, and the only returning characters who aren't non-voiced NPCs are Shulk, Rex, Fiora, Pyra, Mithra, Nia, and Melia. Another thing I know a lot of people were mildly upset about in the main game of 3 was how you only really got to clearly see the worlds merging from the Xenoblade 1 side. The Keves characters as a whole were given a slight more bit of spotlight throughout the entire game, and both the beginning and ending scenes depicted Origin's activation from that perspective, plus there was an entire other scene that showed it from Melia's perspective, while the Aures side only really got a couple slides in a PowerPoint and Nia verbally describing it. Despite the copious amount of flashbacks in the game, only the Keves trio and Ethel actually got original younger looking models, while the 3 Agnes characters were stuck with their normal models scaled down, which is interesting because one of the promotional images for the art book that comes with the special edition had images of a younger looking Mio, which reasonably could be assumed to be from some sort of cut content that also showed her at a much younger term, except for the fact that the outfit she's wearing, in addition to being a reference to the Xenosaga character that references the same Xenogears character as Mio, doesn't really fit the whole Agnes military aesthetic or anything a soldier in Ionios would wear, which suggests that this might be the outfit the original Mio wore in Aures prior to the world's collision, which means that at least at some point it was planned to show that from Mio's perspective as well as just Noah's, and I think a very intriguing intro for a sequel DLC would be showing Mio's perspective, then cutting ahead to an X years later time skip that brings her back up to 19 years old, and picking up the present storyline with the Xenoblade 2 side and Mio as the main playable character, which would go a long way to subvert a lot of the Noah favoritism in the main game, and keep the mystery going for a little bit longer because you still don't have closure on what happened to Noah in the post-credit scene until it eventually cuts back over to the other world. I'm also pretty sure, given her personality and her relatives, that Mio would be a lot more likely to still be a fighter in the original world compared to Noah, so making her the initial lead would also make it a lot easier to justify actually having combat in the early bits of the story. Speaking of that combat though, despite the usual overworld enemies, just like the construction of Origin proposal, there really doesn't seem to be a lot of opportunities to include new enemies to make an actual antagonistic force, does there? While that may be true, I think there are several more ways you could justify it in an epilogue compared to a prequel. Firstly, if you want to have enemies from the 2 worlds themselves, as far as we can tell, it seems like not every single person in both worlds actually knew Origin was going to be a thing, so you could very easily have citizens getting angry about the fact that they were put in this computer and killed and recreated without their consent or knowledge, and that could easily be some sort of major political conflict both worlds have to face, and possibly do so better once they've been unified. But also, if you want to have more supernatural existential threats, I think the idea of the worlds trying to reconnect with each other opens the door a lot more. The only interaction we know as a fact the 2 worlds had with each other prior to Origin's activation was the video calls between Nia and Melia. And while I'm sure they didn't hog the communication lines and at least gave the ones we see them using in the cutscene to Shulk and Tora so they could communicate with each other, there was no actual multiversal shenanigans going on until Ionios itself was created, and that ended up lasting for a grand total of 0 minutes and 0 seconds on the actual timeline. So someone from one world trying to visit the other would be the first time the barriers of universes were breached since Klaus activated the conduit eons ago. My theory, and I think the community's general consensus as of now, is that the conduit still being present in the Xenoblade 2 universe is the thing that kept the 2 worlds from crashing into each other for so long prior to the lead up to Xenoblade 3, which means someone trying to do multiversal things without a conduit present could have disastrous consequences, possibly even on the scale of the experiment in the first place. Remember all the theories about the main villain of 3 being evil Alvis or somehow Galea, or connected to another universe in some way that didn't come true because it turned out that Zed was formed from the two worlds we've been following so far, well, an epilogue based entirely around two worlds trying to connect with each other would be a very easy way to pull stuff like that in. I know I criticized the prequel idea for being too much of a retread of Torna, and this might sort of seem like a retread of Future Connected, but if the villain or villain group ends up being people from another universe leaking into the main two, then there's still a good chance at them actually having personality, which was not the case of the Fog King, who, in addition to the villains of 3 being based on the Gnosis from Xenosaga, unfortunately also foreshadowed how flat the majority of Mobius were. Hell, if you really wanted to, you could still include Consul A, either as a Mobius who somehow escaped the destruction of the entire Order when Zed was taken out, or a Mobius formed after the Endless Now by the fear and sorrow of people being separated from their friends and loved ones from the other world. While there are definitely some thematic issues with the creation of an epilogue, this instead could allow a thematic through line from the main game, where that story ended with people surpassing the Mobius desire to remain in the Endless Now. This one could instead revolve around people's desires to return to it, because, well, healing and moving on from bad things isn't always a straight one-step process, and I think it would be a very Xeno thing to represent something like that by having some form of Mobius still persist in the worlds to follow. Basically, my pitch for this epilogue is starting out with Noah and Mio, starting with Mio of course, in their two separate worlds, working in parallel to try and reunite, joined by a combination of their friends from the main game and returning characters from previous Xenoblade games now aged up and serving more of a mentor role, that eventually pivots into the two worlds working together to stop some even bigger threat from outside the two of them, because it turns out doing meta-universal things without a meta-universe manifold present is not exactly the most stable thing for the health of the multiverse. In a much more self-indulgent sense, this also potentially provides the opportunity for Shulk to utter probably the stupidest line I have ever written in the obligatory conversation that the party has to pump themselves up before marching into the final battle, and that is, of course, okay, let's put an end to this experiment. Because hey, if we're gonna move away from the consequences of Klaus's experiment, you gotta have one stupid mention of it again, right? You might think in terms of pre-existing assets, this premise falls way, way behind the prequel one, but personally I think, for at least the parts where the parties are still in their separate original worlds before meeting each other, there is some stuff you can use. As far as we can tell, the entire Keves Kid Quartet lives in the town outside Alchemoth we saw at the beginning and ending, and hey, those were pre-rendered scenes, but the town is still partially modeled. If they want a hub for the beginning of the Keves side, they don't even need to touch up Definitive Edition assets, they've already got that town. Said town also appears to be located on the Bionis shoulder with Alchemoth moved closer to it, which means they could just touch up that map from Definitive Edition and have that be the big starting area for the Keves side. As for the Agnes side, the shot we see of the other Earth crashing into Allrest is from the perspective of the Gates of Torgoth, which as far as we can tell, would still exist after the end of Xenoblade 2, and I find it hard to believe that Nia, and then by extension Mio, would not be living there, so if they do want to show the merging from Mio's perspective, she'd probably be present there, which means that a touched-up Torgoth and a third rendition of Gormott would probably be the equivalent starting map for the Allrest side. Don't get me wrong, if you count the Edia region being almost entirely that Titan as well, this would be the 4th time in a row where we went to Gormott, and that would be extremely boring, but they could very easily get around that by including elements of other Titans from 2 that didn't necessarily get a lot of love in Ionios, and I'm actually going to single out Uriah here despite it being on the box art because the Orion tunnels are very small and most of Pentelis is not Uriah. The Lost Colony is probably the most Orion-esque place in the game, but it's optional, and in one of the very few pre-Ionios shots of Nia that is fully 3D modeled, we do get to see the Orion Titan close by where she is, so it's probably near where Torgoth ended up. I think a good way to structure this would be to have no more than 2 hours of required story content per world, and then come up with a reason why both groups need to infiltrate their respective halves of origin, probably retrieving a piece of technology or performing some process, which gives you 3 things. A proper final dungeon for this first bit of the story, a way to reuse assets while doing a new take on the partially unpopular Origin final dungeon from the main game, which you can easily justify being completely different looking because we know it was tampered by Zed in Ionios, and a trip through the belly of the machine with people who are actually around and responsible for its construction, which means opportunity to exposit more on how exactly it works. Each party would obviously fight their own boss there, and I think this would be a good place to insert some lingering Mobius influence if you didn't want to go that route for the main villain of the piece. And then the parties would be able to unite, but something bad would happen, releasing the real issue into both worlds, and you then gain access to the main big new area for the expansion, which is either some partial combination of the two worlds in a different sense than Ionios, some virtual reality generated by Origin, the main villain, or a returning conduit or something like that, or just part of a third universe entirely. After that, it's basically a 10-hour victory lap where you actually solve this final problem, we get to see everyone working together, we get more potential fan service opportunities, and all that good stuff. This could also potentially allow the explanation of certain unexplained things from main game Xenoblade 3 besides the secrets of Ionios, and that is more or less things 3 doesn't explain that we can't really hold entirely against 3 because they're also things that 2, and especially Future Connected, didn't explain, and that's mainly stuff regarding the lifespans of all the different races, and what exactly Klaus's last gift did to the blade system in the first place. In Ionios, we clearly see that Machina, who are supposed to live for thousands of years, and blades, who are supposed to be functionally immortal while their driver lives and never visibly age at all, do age at the same rate of a Homs or human across the 10-term lifespan, and the city doesn't help us out whatsoever either, because it seems like all the unique racial traits are recessive, and after enough generations, everyone besides Napon turns into a normal-looking human with a normal-length lifespan. Also, literally everyone in Agnes besides non-Mio Gormati has at least some kind of blade trait, which is pretty weird as well. While you can probably chalk at least the Keves side up to Mobius genetic manipulation in order to equalize things properly for the war, we do still have two Homs, a Hyantia, and a Machina of similar physical ages as close friends in the original world, which seems like a relationship that wouldn't naturally happen given the rate at which they age relative to each other. So some clarification on things like whether or not Hyantia and Machina born after Shulk's recreation of the world age like a Homs would be very nice. As for all rest, Klaus clearly did something with the blade system when he gave his last gift to the world, so it's very possible that blades are able to exist on their own without drivers and, using their human DNA, now reproduce with humans normally, but we don't know anything about that, and any explanation of how anyone from Agnes exists, or even potentially Mio, given that Nia started out as a blade, is just going to be conjecture until we get some actual explanation, which I think would more naturally flow from even just incidental NPC dialogue in an epilogue compared to a prequel still set within Ionios when the natural order of things would still be messed up. All of that is well and good, but the two largest negatives that come with this premise, from a non-gameplay perspective at least, are pretty massive, and I think there's a sizable amount of fans who would not be able to look past them. The first is the usual issue that comes with making a DLC story set after the end of the main campaign, and that is effectively having a second ending that you need to pay more to see. And given how I'm pretty sure there was a developer statement saying that Future Connected was in part made so that people who played the original Xenoblade 1 would have more reason to buy Definitive Edition, I can see why you would be concerned. If the ending of Base 3 was more universally well received and regarded as conclusive, this wouldn't nearly be as much of a problem, but as is, there is a sizable subsection of people who do not think the ending was good, or a good wrap-up, and having a second ending locked behind DLC would not sit well with a lot of those people. On the other hand, the other big sticking point is going to annoy a lot of people who did like the ending, because actually showing the worlds reunite is kind of antithetical to the themes present in the end of the main game, where the whole point is not knowing exactly what's going to happen, but still believing that things are going to turn out alright. And if you've seen my ending video, you know that I think it was pretty explicit that they will see each other again, so actively showing that to the player seems rather redundant. That's not to say that going into the future of those worlds ever is a bad idea. My ideal Xenoblade 4 premise involves the two worlds having been bridged at some point in the distant past, and the protagonists being reincarnated Gondor and Shania, but that's skipping ahead to long after Noah and Mio have reunited themselves and died, and they'll be at most acknowledged in flashbacks or backstory elements, which is massively different from literally showing them reconnecting with each other in real time. Basically, for me at least, the promise of being able to focus on characters I actually already know and care about is enough to outweigh the fact that an epilogue would annoy people who both really hated and really loved the base game's ending, but your mileage may definitely vary on that. I am also somewhat inclined to believe that that is where the developers are leaning as well, as the founders are touched on far less than Torna characters in Xenoblade 2. Any potential cut flashback-related gameplay data people have found in the datamine pertains to earlier stages in the lifespan of the main party, so 990 years after the founders existed, and, again, the hint from the developers that there will be something about the future of the series in the DLC, which would be hard to do in something that took place before the last game on the timeline. That's not to say there's a 0% chance of prequel, of course. I wouldn't be surprised if they did that, or bamboozled us again and gave us some third premise that no one's thought about yet, but I personally think that the most hints point towards epilogue right now, despite the massive drawbacks that would entail. I have actually also seen suggestions of somehow doing both. That is, have some sort of story set after the end of the game, but also include playable flashbacks to elements of the Ionia story that were not completely fleshed out, including the founders. That probably sounds extremely messy to you, and it would be very easy to make it very bad, but I think there's actually some potential in this idea as well, because in this case, you actually wouldn't even need to time skip ahead to have adult-aged Noah and Mio. You could have them the exact same age they are in the post-credits scene, and just talking to adult characters who were around at the time of the founders, so the queens, Rex and Shulk, about Ionios, unlocking their memories, and then when the adults remember things, you get playable flashbacks that take place during key moments in Ionian history. So, you could have Shulk and Rex narrating the tale of the founders to Noah and Mio, and this actually would allow you to maintain the open-endedness of the ending of the main game despite taking place after it, as if you don't age Noah and Mio up to the ages we already saw them at, then you can still leave it a bit ambiguous as to whether or not they meet again, because you could end this epilogue with Shulk and Tora deciding to try and connect the two worlds again, as opposed to the main premise of the epilogue story requiring them to succeed at some point during it. All of this being said, I need to very strictly remind every single person watching this video, including myself, to temper your expectations hard. This is not a brand new full-sized Xenoblade game. This is a story expansion for a full-sized Xenoblade game that you have already played. And in addition to that, it is not the only thing in the DLC expansion pass. We are also getting at least 2 heroes and 2 waves of challenge battle mode. So despite this expansion being the main selling point of the DLC pass, it is not the only thing contributing to the $30 MSRP. We were also told that this DLC will be the size of Torna and not disappoint fans. The second point is kind of moot because that was said before most fans had seen the entirety of Xenoblade 3, so it wouldn't disappoint fans who hadn't played 3 yet, but that wasn't taking into account the general community reaction to 3, so I don't think we can really count that as anything more than PR speak. As for it being the size of Torna, remember how big Torna was. It was great, but it took 15 to 20 hours to 100%. There is no way a DLC story of that same length is going to include every bit of fan service you want from the conclusion to a trilogy. There's just not going to be enough budget or time in that small of a game to include all of the Avengers Endgame looking stuff that you want to see. It's just not going to happen. We're going to get some returning characters no matter what, we're going to get some funny cameos, and some really stupid fan service lines, but we are never going to see every single little thing you want. That's just a fact of life, and if you were already disappointed the main game wasn't just some big massive stupid fan servicey crossover, you're also going to be disappointed with this. Also, if you were expecting some big fan servicey crossover to begin with, then you'd already set yourself up for disappointment because that's not really what they ever pitched the game as, so try not to do that a second time, and keep your expectations in check. Also, no, they're never going to expand on the Saviorite rebels or do something with Klaus again unless an actual big prequel happens, because they're dead. They do not matter anymore. Stop asking for Xenoblade 3 to include them. There's no point. Ultimately, and this is definitely an opinion no one else is going to share with me, but I think the one thing I want most out of this DLC is not necessarily it to be a send-off to the Xenoblade trilogy, but a send-off to Xenoblade games being as heavily based on the original Xenogears Perfect Works story as they have been. The year the DLC drops will have been 25 years since the release of Xenogears, and the entire Xeno series has been heavily based on the original plans for that game's expanded universe the entire time, and I think they've used up basically every idea they can. So I think that taking that into account, with Xenoblade 3's big message of moving on and accepting that things are going to change, now would be a good time to close the door on that book, except that there's no way we're ever going to see a full realization of the original 6-part 10,000 year story for Gears, and that's okay, because we saw most of the elements of it across the 25 years of Xeno games. And while we can still include things like the Zohar, and reincarnation, and the red sword that has mysterious powers, we don't have to be beholden to the past every single time we make a new game that has Xeno in the title. If this truly is a stopping point, as we have been told, then it doesn't necessarily need to be a stopping point for the series as a whole, which we already know, or even the ongoing plotline, just for that kind of thing. And I think that's a good place to do it. I've said stuff like this before, and I hope that that's going to be the big takeaway from the DLC, as well as, of course, the big hint towards the future that they've been teasing. Until next time, this is Luxon, signing off.